Scaloni Porro sat behind his heavy obsidian desk on the top floor of the Porro Heights building, staring out at a Chicago skyline that trembled at his name. At 68 years old, he had built a shadow empire worth hundreds of millions. The dark, jagged ink of a tattoo crawled up his neck, a permanent reminder of the violence and sacrifice it took to reach the top. But on this gray November morning, his power felt like ash. The woman standing across from him, his mistress Evelyn, didn't look like a bearer of bad news. She looked like a woman who had just seen a murder. She slid a manila folder across the desk, her fingers trembling slightly. Inside were photographs that Scaloni's mind initially refused to recognize. The first photo showed a young woman with a messy ponytail and a faded gray hoodie, standing in a line at a South Side soup kitchen. Another showed her sleeping on a narrow, rusted bunk in a crowded room. The final image captured her scrubbing a massive industrial pot, her slender arms covered in gray soap suds. Scaloni's hand, scarred from decades of street wars, began to shake. He traced the girl's high cheekbones and the fierce, intelligent spark in her eyes. It was like looking at a ghost, the exact image of his daughter, Sophia, who had died 18 years ago. "That's impossible," Scaloni growled, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "Jenny is in boarding school in Switzerland. Jane sends me the progress reports every month. She's supposed to have the best of everything." Evelyn leaned in, her voice a terrified whisper. "Scaloni, I've been watching the accounts like you asked. The address Jane gave you? That's a lakefront mansion she bought in her own name. She's living there with her own biological children, sending them to private academies. But Jenny? Jenny has been at the Mercy House shelter for months. Before that, Jane had her hidden in a rundown tenement, treating her like a servant until the day she turned 18, then she threw her out with nothing." Scaloni felt his chest tighten with a rage that surpassed anything he had felt in his criminal career. For 18 years, he had faithfully funded that girl's life. Not once had he missed a transfer of $25,000 a month into the trust. He had trusted Jane because she was the one who held him when Sophia died. He had been a man drowning in grief, a kingpin who couldn't figure out how to be a grandfather to a newborn baby while fighting a war for territory. Jane had promised to raise Jenny as a Porro princess. Scaloni, blinded by his own pain, had agreed to stay away, believing Jane's lie that his presence would only bring the darkness of the life to the child. He had convinced himself that money was a shield. Now, looking at the girl in the hoodie, he realized the magnitude of his failure. He hadn't been sending a shield, he had been funding his granddaughter's prison. "Get the cars," Scaloni said, standing up with a sudden, violent grace. "We're going to the South Side. And Evelyn, call the cleaners. By the time I get back, I want every bank record Jane ever touched on my desk. If she stole a single cent of Jenny's blood money, she's going to find out exactly why they call me the Butcher of Chicago." As the elevator descended, Scaloni looked at his reflection. He had spent 18 years being a coward, hiding behind checks and trust funds because he was too afraid to look at a child who had his daughter's eyes. He had let a snake into his house, and that snake had feasted on his granddaughter's future. He wasn't just a mafia boss anymore. He was a grandfather who had finally woken up. The caravan of 3 blacked-out SUVs cut through the slush of the South Side like a funeral procession for the life Jane thought she had secured. When the vehicles screeched to a halt in front of Mercy House, the neighborhood went silent. This was not the territory of men in $4,000 suits, and the air seemed to chill as Scaloni Porro stepped onto the cracked pavement. He didn't wait for his security detail to scout the perimeter. He walked toward the peeling gray doors of the shelter with a predatory grace, his overcoat snapping in the wind, the dark ink of the tattoo on his neck pulsing with every heavy beat of his heart. Inside, the smell hit him first, a suffocating mixture of industrial bleach, old cabbage, and the damp scent of too many desperate souls in one room. It was a world Scaloni had spent 40 years making sure his family would never have to see, yet here he was, standing in the middle of his greatest failure. Men and women in line for midday soup parted like the Red Sea as he moved toward the kitchen, his presence a violent anomaly in a place of quiet defeat. He found her in the back, obscured by a cloud of steam rising from a massive galvanized sink. The photographs in the folder hadn't prepared him for the reality. Jenny wasn't just poor. She looked exhausted, her frame thin beneath a stained apron that was 3 sizes too large. She was hunched over, her small hands raw and red from the scalding water as she scrubbed at a scorched industrial pot with a ferocity that spoke of a girl who had been told her only worth was her labor. Scaloni stopped 10 feet away, his cold, calculated exterior finally fracturing. For decades, he had been the man who felt nothing, the man who ordered hits over espresso and settled blood feuds with a nod. But seeing Sophia's eyes in this girl's hollow face, seeing his own bloodline reduced to a scullery maid while Jane draped herself in stolen silks, caused a visceral crack in his soul. The $5 million he had sent was supposed to be a fortress around her. Instead, it had been the price Jane paid to keep her in this hell. "Jenny," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that cut through the clatter of the kitchen. The girl froze. She didn't look up at first, her shoulders tensing as if expecting a reprimand. When she finally turned, her gaze was wary, guarded by the hard-won survival instincts of the streets. She looked at the man in the expensive coat, the man with the terrifying tattoos and the eyes that held a city's worth of secrets. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice trembling but defiant. Scaloni reached out, his gloved hand hovering near the sink, before he pulled it back, realizing he was a monster trying to touch a miracle. "I'm the man who should have been here 18 years ago," he whispered, the fury in his chest turning into a cold, hard promise of retribution. "And I'm the man who's going to make them pay for every dish you ever washed." The memory hit Scaloni like a physical blow, the sterile stench of the shelter's bleach dissolving into the ozone-heavy scent of a Chicago hospital room 18 years ago. He could still feel the agonizing chill of that night, a night when all his underworld millions couldn't buy his daughter, Sophia, 5 more minutes of breath. He remembered Sophia's hand in his, limp and pale, as the light faded from her eyes, leaving behind a screaming infant and a kingpin who felt, for the first time in his life, utterly powerless. Jane had been there, a silhouette of calculated grace draped in mourning black before the body was even cold. While Scaloni stood paralyzed by grief that threatened to swallow his empire, Jane had stepped into the vacuum with the precision of a scavenger. When Scaloni had reached for the crying bundle in the nursery, Jane was the one who intercepted him. She had placed a hand on his chest, her eyes shimmering with a performance so perfect it had lasted nearly 2 decades. "Her blood is your blood, Scaloni, but your life is a graveyard," she had whispered, her voice like silk over a jagged blade. She had taken the baby, cradling her against a designer dress, and made what she called her holy vow. She swore on the gold crucifix around her neck, promising that the child would be raised in the light, shielded from the stain of the Porro name, and given the peace that Sophia had been denied. She convinced him that his very presence would bring the darkness of the Mafia down on the child's head, that if he truly loved his granddaughter, he would stay in the shadows and simply provide. Scaloni, blinded by the wreckage of his heart, had believed her. He had handed over the baby and the first of many millions, thinking he was buying a fortress of safety. He hadn't realized he was actually signing a contract with a monster. Jane hadn't been protecting the girl. She had been isolating a victim. She had weaponized his own guilt against him, turning his desire for the girl's purity into a wall that kept him from seeing the slow, systematic theft of a life. Every holy word she spoke that night had been a lie, a foundation of sand built to support her own greed. As Scaloni looked at Jenny now, standing amidst the ruins of that broken promise, he realized that Jane hadn't just stolen the money. She had spent 18 years trying to erase the last living piece of his daughter. The grief that had once made him a coward was gone, replaced by a cold, sharpening clarity. The holy promise was dead, and in its place, the butcher of Chicago was finally coming home to collect. Evelyn sat across from Scaloni in the plush leather interior of the armored SUV as it sped away from the south side, the city lights blurring into streaks of cold neon against the bulletproof glass. She watched his hands, the way his fingers flexed, as if he were already imagining them around Jane's throat. She knew the danger of this moment better than anyone. In the Porro family, speaking against the boss's wife was usually a one-way ticket to a shallow grave in the marshes, but Evelyn had lived long enough in the shadows to know when a fire was worth the burn. "Why, Evelyn?" Scaloni's voice was a low, dangerous vibration that seemed to rattle the very frame of the vehicle. "Why risk your life to bring me this folder? You know what I do to people who bring me lies about my family." Evelyn didn't blink. She reached into her bag and pulled out a digital tablet, the screen glowing with a labyrinth of spreadsheets and offshore wire transfers that looked like a map of a bloodied battlefield. "Because Jane started getting sloppy, Scaloni. She thought your grief made you blind, and she thought my position made me irrelevant. She treated me like furniture, talking about her investments on the phone while I sat in the room. But I grew up in the same gutters as you. I know what a hustle looks like, and I know the smell of a rat even when it's wearing Chanel." She swiped through the data, showing the $25,000 monthly deposits from Scaloni's primary trust. The money never touched a school in Switzerland. Instead, it detoured through a shell company in the Caymans before landing in a secret account Jane used to fund high-stakes baccarat in Atlantic City and private debt settlements for her biological brother's failed construction firms. "I followed the ghost of that money for 6 months," Evelyn continued, her voice steady despite the lethal weight of her betrayal. "I saw the mansions Jane bought under aliases. I saw the tuition checks for her nieces. And then I found the smallest, most heartbreaking trail of all, the paper trail that ended at a dingy apartment in the Heights where Jenny was being kept like a prisoner, and the final eviction notice that sent her to the streets the day she turned 18. Evelyn looked Scaloni directly in the eye, her gaze unflinching. "I risked my life because I watched my own mother rot in a place like Mercy House while men like you looked the other way. I couldn't watch Jane do it to a child who carries your soul. I knew if I was wrong, you'd kill me. But I knew if I was right, and I stayed silent, I'd be just as much of a monster as she is." She had played the ultimate gambit, betting her life on Scaloni's capacity for a grandfather's love over a husband's loyalty. As Scaloni stared at the cold, hard numbers, the mathematical proof of a stolen childhood, the silence in the car became a physical weight. Evelyn hadn't just brought him information, she had handed him the blade he needed to cut out the cancer in his own home. The mistress had done what the wife refused to do. She had protected the Porro bloodline. The war room in the basement of Scaloni's estate felt like a tomb, cold and silent save for the hum of high-powered servers and the rhythmic clicking of keys. These weren't the men who filed Scaloni's legal tax returns. They were forensic predators, specialists who moved through the dark web like ghosts. Marco, a man with a genius-level IQ and a rap sheet for wire fraud longer than a confession, didn't look up as Scaloni entered. He simply tapped a key, and the massive glass wall illuminated with a digital map of a massacre. "It wasn't just a theft, Don Scaloni," Marco said, his voice as dry as parchment. "It was an extraction. Every month, like clockwork, that $5 million was bled out." The numbers flickered in harsh white light against the dark glass. The trail was a labyrinth of shell companies and offshore havens, Cayman accounts, Panamanian trusts, and laundered transfers through a boutique jewelry firm in Milan. But the most damning evidence lay in the destination. The money hadn't gone to tutors or trust funds, or the elite boarding schools Scaloni had been promised. It had vanished into the high-stakes baccarat pits of Macau and the private debt ledgers of Atlantic City. "Jane has a shadow life," Marco continued, pulling up a series of credit markers. "She didn't just spend the money, she chased it. She's been underwater for years. She used Jenny's inheritance to pay off local bookies and international cartels. While the girl was sleeping on a metal cot, Jane was losing $60,000 a hand in the private suites of the Venetian." Scaloni leaned closer, his eyes narrowing as he saw a specific date highlighted in red. It was the date of Jenny's 18th birthday, the day she had been cast out of her tenement and into the Mercy House shelter. On that exact afternoon, a wire transfer for $50,000 had been moved from Jenny's fund to a real estate agent in Oak Park. "She bought a vacation home," Scaloni whispered, the words tasting like copper in his mouth. The day she threw my granddaughter to the wolves, she bought herself a sanctuary with a swimming pool. The cold, mathematical proof of the betrayal was more sickening than a physical blow. $5 million, a sum meant to be a girl's entire future, had been treated like loose change by a woman who had traded a child's safety for the thrill of a card game. Scaloni watched the ledger of greed scroll past, each line item a fresh scar on his conscience. He had been the provider, the iron wall of the Porro family, yet he had funded the very weapon used to destroy his daughter's legacy. The accountants had finished their job. They had counted the cost. Now it was time for Scaloni to collect the debt, and in his world, that kind of interest was always paid in more than just currency. The elevator doors slid open with a whisper, revealing a world of marble, glass, and silent, predatory luxury. Jenny stepped onto the hand-woven Persian rug, her worn-out sneakers looking like a stain against the silver-threaded fibers. She stood frozen, her eyes wide as she stared through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Chicago skyline, the same city where she had spent the last 6 months wandering as a ghost, sleeping in doorways and praying for a meal that wasn't served in a plastic bowl. Scaloni watched her from the shadows of the foyer, his chest aching as he saw her flinch when a housemaid stepped forward to take her tattered, bleach-stained hoodie. To Jenny, this wasn't a sanctuary. It was a museum of everything she had been told she didn't deserve. Scaloni led her down a long hallway lined with original oils to a door that had remained locked for 18 years. When he pushed it open, the scent of lavender and fresh linen drifted out. The suite was a masterpiece of soft creams and gold, featuring a library of untouched classics and a walk-in closet filled with designer labels, the tags still dangling like tiny white flags. "I was told you lived here," Scaloni said, his voice thick with the gravel of a decade's worth of regret. "Every holiday, every birthday, Jane told me you were here, safe in this room. She sent me letters she said you wrote. She told me you were happy, becoming the woman Sophia would have been proud of." Jenny walked slowly to the vanity, her fingers trembling as she picked up a silver-framed photograph of her mother. She looked at her own reflection in the mirror, hollow-cheeked and weary, then back at the smiling woman in the photo. "I thought you hated me," she whispered, the words barely audible over the hum of the penthouse's climate control. "Jane told me I was a mistake. She said you sent me away to that tenement because looking at me reminded you of the daughter you lost. She said you were the one who stopped the payments because I was a burden you couldn't afford to care about anymore." The air in the room seemed to vanish, replaced by a vacuum of pure, cold fury. Scaloni realized then that the theft of the $5 million was the least of Jane's crimes. She hadn't just stolen currency. She had assassinated a grandfather's love and a child's sense of belonging. She had meticulously painted Scaloni as a monster to the girl, and the girl as an inconvenience to the man, building a wall of hatred out of thin air just to ensure no one would ever question where the money went. He walked to the desk in the corner and pulled a heavy leather ledger from the drawer, laying it open before her. "You were never a mistake, Jenny. You were my only reason to keep breathing. And the money? It never ran out." He pointed to the steady, rhythmic deposits that stretched back 18 years. "It was stolen by the woman who told you those lies, so she could live in a mansion while you slept on a cot." As Jenny touched the silk sheets of the bed she was meant to grow up in, the realization of the manufactured abandonment settled over her like a cold shroud. She wasn't a stray who had been rescued by a stranger. She was a princess who had been kidnapped in plain sight by her own family. Looking at Scaloni, the flickering fear in her eyes began to harden into the same cold, unbreakable steel that had built the Porro Empire. The girl who had scrubbed floors was dead, and the rightful heir had finally come to claim her throne. The dining room of the Porro estate felt less like a setting for a meal and more like a courtroom where the sentence had already been decided. Crystal chandeliers cast a sharp, cold light over the long mahogany table, where silver cloches sat atop fine china, steam rising as if from a ritual sacrifice. Jane entered with her usual calculated elegance, draped in a midnight blue silk gown that Scaloni now knew was paid for with Jenny's blood. She wore a smile of practiced innocence, unaware that the predator across the table had already seen the rot beneath her skin. "It's rare for us to dine alone these days, Scaloni," she said, her voice a purr of false affection as she took her seat. "I hope this means the business is finally settling." Scaloni didn't speak. He stared at her, his dark eyes unblinking, the tattoo on his neck a jagged shadow in the flickering candlelight. With a slow, deliberate motion, he reached for the silver handle of the first cloche and lifted it. There was no steak beneath it, no delicate appetizer. There was only a single, grainy photograph of Jenny, thin and hollow-eyed, scrubbing a blackened industrial pot at Mercy House. Jane's smile didn't just fade. It disintegrated. The color drained from her face, leaving her skin looking like curdled milk in the harsh light. "Scaloni, I can explain that girl. She was troubled. She ran away." "The first course is silence," Scaloni interrupted, his voice a lethal rasp that seemed to drop the temperature in the room by 20 degrees. He lifted the second cloche. Underneath lay a thick stack of wire transfer receipts, millions of dollars moving from the Porro Trust directly into a high-stakes baccarat account in Macau and a luxury real estate firm in Oak Park. "The second course is the truth. For 18 years, I fed you my trust, and you fed me lies. I gave you $5 million to build a fortress for Sophia's daughter, and you used it to buy a palace for yourself and a grave for her spirit." He threw the manila folder from the war room onto the table, the papers sliding across the polished wood like a deck of cards dealt by the devil. "You told me she was in Switzerland. You told her I was a monster who stopped the payments because I couldn't bear to look at her. But the numbers don't lie, Jane. They show a woman who gambled away a child's life to satisfy a greed that has no bottom." The clatter of his silver fork hitting the plate sounded like a gunshot in the silent room. He leaned forward, the terrifying weight of his power filling the space until the air felt too thick to breathe. "I am the butcher of Chicago, Jane. You thought because I loved you once, I had forgotten how to carve out the rod in my own house. But tonight, dinner is over. You're going to sign over every asset, every hidden account, and every deed you bought with stolen money. And then, you are going to pray that the police reach this house before my men do." Jane didn't scream. She made a sound like a wounded animal, a low, desperate whimper as the reality of her collapse settled into the room. She looked at the gold band on her finger, the symbol of the protection she had worn like a suit of armor for 20 years, and realized it had become a shackle. Scaloni didn't wait for her to plead. He snapped his fingers, and two of his associates, men who had once bowed to Jane as their queen, stepped out of the shadows. With a cold, clinical efficiency, they moved behind her chair. One of them reached down and firmly pried the diamond-encrusted Porro crest ring from her hand, the metal scraping against her skin as he reclaimed the family's honor. "You are no longer a Porro," Scaloni said, his voice as final as a slamming vault door. "You are Jane Johnson again, a woman with no name, no fortune, and no friends. Every deed, every offshore account, and every luxury you bought with Jenny's life has been signed back into her name. You are leaving this house with exactly what you gave my granddaughter. Nothing but the clothes on your back." As the men hauled her from the velvet chair, the front doors of the estate swung open. The flashing blue and red lights of federal vehicles strobed against the marble foyer, casting a chaotic rhythm over the high-ceilinged room. Scaloni had spent decades keeping the police away from his gates, but for Jane, he had opened the doors wide. The forensic evidence Marco had compiled, the counts of wire fraud, embezzlement, and money laundering, was enough to ensure she would spend the next 2 decades in a federal cell. But in Scaloni's world, the legal system was only the beginning of the sentence. He leaned in close as she was led past him in handcuffs, her silk dress rustling against the cold steel. "The police will take you to a cell," he whispered, his eyes burning with a dark, predatory light. "But the streets will take your soul. I've put out the word from Chicago to Atlantic City. You are a pariah. Anyone who helps you, anyone who speaks your name, anyone who offers you a place to hide when you finally crawl out of prison will answer to me. You betrayed the bloodline, Jane. And in this city, that is the only sin that never gets a pardon." Jane was dragged out into the cold November night, her desperate cries silenced by the closing of the heavy oak doors. Scaloni stood in the center of his silent palace, the weight of 18 years of failure finally beginning to lift. He looked up the grand staircase, where Jenny stood in the shadows of the landing, watching the woman who had tormented her disappear into the dark. The justice wasn't just in the handcuffs or the seized accounts. It was in the way Jenny stood a little taller, her shoulders no longer hunched under the weight of a lie. The butcher of Chicago had finished his work, and for the first time in 18 years, the house of Porro was clean. The transition from the shadows to the light didn't happen overnight, but Scaloni Porro approached the liquidation of his criminal empire with the same cold, surgical precision he had once used to conquer it. He began the slow, arduous process of bleeding his dark assets into the light, transforming blood money into a legacy that could finally bear Sophia's name without shame. The illegal gambling dens and the extortion rings were systematically dismantled, replaced by the Sophia Porro Legacy Foundation, a multi-million-dollar venture dedicated to providing a safety net for the thousands of young women lost in the cracks of the city's shelter system. Jenny didn't just inherit the wealth, she became the architect of its redemption. No longer the girl in the faded hoodie, she walked through the halls of the Foundation's new headquarters with a sharp, quiet authority, overseeing the very programs that would have saved her 18 years ago. She worked with the same ferocity she had once used to scrub pots, but now, she was scrubbing the stain off her family's history. Scaloni watched her from the periphery, his role shifting from a kingpin to a quiet counselor, a man who had finally realized that true power wasn't found in a gun or a territory, but in the ability to restore what had been broken. On a quiet morning 1 year after the final sit-down, Scaloni and Jenny stood together at Sophia's grave. The marble was clean, the grass green, and the air was free of the suffocating guilt that had defined Scaloni's life for 2 decades. He placed a hand on his granddaughter's shoulder, his scarred fingers finally steady. The $5 million trust fund was long gone, spent on brick-and-mortar hope for the forgotten, but the inheritance Jenny had received was far more valuable, a name that stood for something other than fear, and a grandfather who had finally learned to be present. The butcher of Chicago was gone, buried under the weight of his own atonement, and in his place stood a man who had finally found a way to win the only war that mattered, the fight for his family's soul. If this story of betrayal and ultimate redemption moved you, please hit the like button and share it with someone who needs to see that it's never too late to fix a failure. Stories like Scaloni and Jenny's remind us that while the family that is supposed to protect us can sometimes become our greatest enemy, justice and healing are always possible when we find the courage to face the truth. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a tale of resilience and restoration. What would you have done if you were in Scaloni's shoes? Drop a comment below and join the conversation. Until next time, remember, your future isn't defined by where you started, but by how you choose to rise.